Hello, welcome to Chapter 8. We have finished up Chapter 7, which was all of the cytology and cell biology portion of Honors Biology, and we have entered Chapter 8, which is photosynthesis, and this picture is showing you a certain portion of that photosynthetic and cell respiration pathway. It's showing you basically the electron transport chain and the chemiosmosis portion, which is an ATP synthase enzyme. We will get into that, but we want to kind of set up a foundation for photosynthesis, and we want to understand how these molecules that are accepting and transferring electrons, how they work. And so that's going to be the topic of this first lecture. We're going to talk about specifically oxidation and reduction reactions. Chapter 8 is going to be one of the first, well, is the first really difficult or fairly difficult chapters in a series of about 5 lectures, or about 5 chapters. The chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 all are going to be fairly rigorous, and so it's going to require you to not only study frequently, but make sure you're paying attention in class, make sure you're taking good notes, make sure you're doing and completing all of the online lectures and quizzes before they're due. But let's go ahead and get started. So heterotrophs and autotrophs are umbrella terms used to describe organisms. Autotrophs are self-feeding plants or self-feeding organisms, and plants are an example of an autotroph, and I underline auto here. Auto is a prefix that means self, and so just like an automatic is a car with a transmission that will shift itself, autotroph is an organism that will feed itself, and photosynthetic plants are going to feed themselves by producing glucose through a process called photosynthesis. Now there are other organisms like chemosynthetic bacteria, and they're going to use a process called chemosynthesis or chemiosynthesis, which requires not light energy but uses other forms of energy like chemicals from their environment in order to produce glucose and produce the things they need for food. But anyhow, all of the organisms that produce their own food are going to be under the umbrella term autotroph, and other, the other term heterotroph, those are organisms like consumers, and so heterotrophs are going to be the consumers like cats and rats and bats and humans that have to consume others in order to produce. And so hetero is a prefix that means others, and troph again means feeding, and so these are organisms that feed on others like consumers. Okay, so what's the big distinction? Autotroph is a self-feeding organism. Both chemosynthesis and photosynthesis are ways in which autotrophs produce their own food. Heterotroph is an organism that consumes others, like a lion consuming a gazelle. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about redox. Redox reactions are reduction and oxidation reactions, and we put oxidation and reduction reactions together and produce this term because when you have a reduction, you always have to have an oxidation, and when you have an oxidation, you always have to have a reduction. Okay? Oxidation is the losing of an electron, and the reduction is the gaining of an electron. Okay? And so when one molecule loses, let's just say this molecule, when one molecule loses an electron, it is said to be oxidized. Okay? It has lost an electron. And when this molecule gains this electron that was just lost by this molecule is said to be reduced. Now I know reduced sounds like you're losing something, or you're losing or reducing the number of whatever you're talking about, but in this case, reduction means that you're reducing the activation state of that molecule. You're gaining electrons. And so one thing I want you to remember is this little acronym, oil rig. Okay, OILRIG. Oxidation is losing electrons. Reduction is gaining electrons. Okay, oxidation is losing electrons. Reduction is gaining electrons. If you remember oil rig anytime you're asked about a specific molecule that is gaining or losing electrons, I think if you just go to oil rig, you will always get them right, because oxidation is losing electrons, reduction is gaining electrons. They're said to be coupled reactions because I just said that. When one molecule loses an electron, that electron doesn't just stay in space. That electron has to be picked up by another molecule. And so when one molecule picks up an electron, that electron had to be pulled off of another molecule. And so we have this coupling of an oxidation and a reduction that happens together. And so that's again why we put those terms together to produce this overall reaction called redox. Okay, I mean, simple analogy. If I have $10 and I have enough, if I have enough money to buy my own lunch, but one of my students doesn't have enough money to buy their lunch, if I gave them $2, I have lost $2. I gave up $2. My total number of dollars has been reduced by 2, but I am said to have been oxidized because I gave up those $2. Well, I didn't just throw those $2 into the hallway and just like let them sit there until they were picked up by someone. And so the $2 were given to another student, and that student was said to be reduced because they have gained those $2. Okay, so that's a coupled reaction. I gave money away, someone gained the money, and so it's a coupled reaction. Oil rig. Oxidation is losing, reduction is gaining. The easiest way to strip a molecule of an electron is to remove that electron from a hydrogen atom. Now, you know at this point that a hydrogen atom is a hydrogen with one proton and one electron. If you look at hydrogen on the periodic table, it has a mass of 1 and it has a number of 1. So the atomic number says that it's 1 proton, and the mass says that it's 1, so it has to be just the 1 proton, no neutrons. And so the easiest way to remove an electron from a molecule is to take this electron and strip it from a hydrogen. And when you do that, it causes the production of an H+ ion. Now, that H+ ion, if you remember back from chapter 2, when we talked about ions, that ion is basically just a proton. Okay, that H+ ion is a proton, and these hydrogen ions are going to be very, very, very important when we learn about photosynthesis and cell respiration. Okay, H+ ions are going to do a lot of things and are going to produce a lot of molecules. But these H+ ions are going to do work for us, and they're going to be accepted by a hydrogen carrier that we're going to talk about later. Some of those hydrogen carriers can be NAD+, they could be NADP+, but all of those things, they could be FAD. All of these things are hydrogen carriers, and not only are they going to carry hydrogen, but they're going to carry electrons. In NADP+ case, they're going to take an H+ ion, and they're going to accept 2 electrons, and eventually will produce NADPH. And we'll get into that later. If you don't understand that right now, it's fine. But this is a molecule that will be a final, a big energy carrier, or a big hydrogen ion and electron carrier that will eventually go and carry those things to where they need to go. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so a little bit more about oxidation reduction reactions. Redox. Anytime you have a reduction, you have to have an oxidation. Remember that. The hydrogen carrier in this instant is called NAD+. Okay, I just talked about that. NAD+ and NADP+ are both cations. They're positive, right? Positive ions are cations. And it is going to be reduced, which means it's going to accept 2 electrons. Remember, if you gain electrons, the rig part of oil rig, when you gain electrons, you are going to be reduced. And so this carrier, NADP or NAD+ or NADP+, is going to accept a hydrogen ion and 2 electrons. When you add the 2 negatives to our positive and add another positive, you end up with a neutrally charged NADH or NADPH molecule. The second electron comes from a hydrogen atom, leaving in the H+, which is left in the cytoplasm. Okay, so just to kind of wrap this up, NAD+ is a cation. It's like an empty taxi. And inside that molecule is just like a car. It's going to have the passenger seat, and it's going to have 2 seats in the back. The driver obviously is off limits. We're going to have an H+ ion that's going to jump in one of the seats. Okay, so we put in hydrogen in one of the seats. We're going to take 2 electrons and we're going to put them in the back seats. Now when we add the 2 electrons and a hydrogen, we have essentially filled up this molecule. And because we've filled up the molecule, which was positive to begin with another positive in the hydrogen ion and 2 negatives in the electrons, we basically cross all those out because they cancel each other, and we end up with a neutrally charged NADH molecule, which is a full taxi. NADP+ or NAD+ is an empty taxi. NADH is a full taxi. That plus sign is kind of like the glowing light on the top of a taxi that says they're vacant, right? You know that when the taxi's light's on, it's vacant. When it's off, it's not vacant. And so it's kind of the same thing. This can accept passengers. This cannot accept passengers. This shows you a little bit of what it means to be oxidized or reduced. Remember, if this is a molecule, if we oxidize it, meaning we're going to pull off electrons, which is going to rip this hydrogen off or rip both of the hydrogens off, we eventually get this molecule plus our 2 hydrogens plus our 2 electrons. We're going to give those hydrogens and electrons, which are down here, to our NAD+. This is our empty taxi. It's going to pick up our passengers and is going to be reduced because it gained electrons and is going to produce NADH, which is our full taxi. Just to kind of wrap up, the redox reaction results in the transfer of energy to produce ATP. Ultimately, we are making NADH or NADPH to carry the electrons and H+ ions to specific locations where energy will be made. Okay, so NADH delivers the electrons to an electron carrier molecule, which usually is the electron transport chain. As the electron carriers pass the electrons to another, little energy is released. Okay, we're only going to release a little bit of energy, which is important because we want to store as much energy as we can. And the energy from the electron transfer allows ATP to be made. Once these electrons and hydrogen ions are delivered to the electron carrier molecules, we will use the electrons and hydrogen ions to produce ATP, usually using the enzyme ATP synthase. Oxidation reduction reactions continued as electrons are passed down the electron transport chain. Eventually has to end up being accepted by another molecule. The final electron acceptor in cell respiration is O2. The final electron acceptor in photosynthesis is NADP+. Okay, so oxygen or NADP+ are going to work the exact same way. And both of those are going to be the final electron acceptor. Those final electron acceptors will accept the final electrons and will release them or get rid of them. And so this process of the electron transport chain is a gradual reduction of O2 or a gradual release, very controlled way to remove energy. And if it wasn't controlled, or if we didn't have a way to control the reduction of the oxygen, you would have an explosion of mass proportions inside the cell, and a bunch of heat energy and a bunch of light energy would be released at once, and the cell that this happened in would be in trubs, and the organism that is made of the cell that this happened in would be in trubs, and so bad things would happen, which is why, again, we want a very slow, gradual release of energy over time. I think that's where we're going to end it. See ya. Mr. P out.